others have been intimidated, attacked, arrested, and imprisoned. And, this is nothing new. Journalists have always been on the front lines in the battle of information, but now they are up against leaders that are increasingly determined to use everything in their arsenals to keep their citizens in the dark. And it's not just overseas. Here in the US, Fox News anchor Chris Wallace has said that President Trump is engaged in the most direct assault on freedom of the press in our country's history. And these attacks are working to undermine the public's confidence in the mainstream news outlets. Case in point, more than 6 in 10 adults think that the news media has exaggerated the risks of COVID-19, even as the death toll is well above 60,000. So despite this gloomy backdrop on this World Press Freedom Day, I am very grateful that we are here to celebrate the principles and ideals of a free press. I think we need to do that. But we also need to educate people about the value of a free press, remind leaders around the world to respect laws that safeguard journalists and press freedom, and galvanize public support and the resources to safeguard our free press, and of course celebrate journalists who are risking their own freedom and lives to hold those in power to account. So over to you, Susan.
Amazing. Yeah, lots of issues and lots of points to cover. I think in terms of just here in the United States, it's been a back and forth. Just to give a sort of another view in terms of how journalists have been dealing with the Trump administration. I think that we have to look inwards as well about how we've been reacting perhaps to how the president has been responding to different outlets in particular, and how those outlets have been responding to the information the president has been putting out. The American public is very polarized, as we know, and that polarization is often not seen in the media landscape. At times, the media has been accused of being one-sided, and I think that that is something that we have to, as journalists, also look inwards to try to find out, at what point are we playing politics, and at what point are we, sharing information, accurate information for the American public. And I think that during COVID-19, that's sort of the feel right now, that we can put the blame game aside for now, put partisan politics aside. Let's just know what the numbers are. Let's build our country, and let's all sort of come together. That would be ideal. I don't know how far we can really go in terms of that in an election year, but that's definitely, I think, what the people want, what the American public want. And I think we as journalists, we have had our run in blaming the administration. But we really do have to look inwards to see how we can serve the American public and also around the world as well. So that's my intro, I think, and I would love to hear from the other panelists.
I think, Tom, I don't know if Tom spoke already. I'm sorry for the interruption with the internet here. So sorry. Tom, I know that the PEN America placed a lawsuit against the Trump administration, which has been approved recently as legit. Can you give us your perspective and opinion on how the current administration is managing the situation in regards to the press freedom and the independence, the editorial independence of media and media representatives? And what is your feeling and view in regards to the message that is sent out on behalf of the United States current administration across the globe in regards to the management of the relationship with the media?
Sure. Thanks, Thanos. Thanks for the invitation. And I know some of you previously, and I'm glad to meet the rest of this distinguished panel. I'll come to our lawsuit against the president in a moment to respond to your direct question, Thanos. But let me build on the gloomy introductions by Susan and Sissel by pointing out that in the context of the coronavirus over these last 2.5 months, the ongoing decimation of local news gathering around the United States has been accelerated. The devastation is more than 2,000 local newspapers have closed in the last few years across the country. There's a lot of reasons for that. The digital platforms have come in and stolen their ad revenue. Other economic pressures on local news around the United States. But in this corona crisis, when people are turning more and more frequently to local news outlets to find out what the school situation is, what the economic situation is in their neighborhoods, in their towns. They can't get it from CNN or Fox News. They need local news outlets that are in their communities. And many of them have been, so they're more needed than ever during this crisis, and they're continuing to accelerate their shutdown. Many of them have eliminated paywalls to make their information available to. There's no ad revenue coming in because the stores and the restaurants that might have advertised are closed up. So it's been a double whammy for local news across the United States. And we have joined with, gathered a coalition of more than 60 organizations and expert individuals, and we're weighing in with Congress each week of the last month, trying to get them to target some of the fiscal stimulus relief to local news organizations to enable them to survive these months of shutting down of the economy. And we were able to attract the interest of members of House and Senate alike to send their own letters echoing our call for targeting some of these local organizations. So I'm confident that more and more members of Congress at least are made aware of this ongoing problem, which has been with us for several years. They're now willing to step up and speak up on behalf of local news. As Thanos mentioned, one of the other things that we at PEN America have been doing in this context is that 2 years ago, we filed a lawsuit against Donald J. Trump, saying that while he is entitled to his own First Amendment rights, he can say what he wants, he can bloviate and lie, and it's all under the First Amendment. But what he can't do is use the levers of government to punish other people for speech he doesn't like. And journalists are central to that community of people whose speech he doesn't like. And so, you know, the stories of taking away the White House press passes for Jim Acosta and Caitlin Collins and others, they're members of our organization. We're a membership organization. So on behalf of them and on behalf of others, we filed a lawsuit. One of the specifics cited in our lawsuit is the way that because President Trump is unhappy with the Washington Post's coverage of him, he's decided to attack the owner, Jeff Bezos, by raising the postal rates on the service that Amazon and the Postal Service jointly used to deliver packages to people's homes. So he's trying to financially punish Jeff Bezos and Amazon because he doesn't like what Jeff Bezos' other company, the Washington Post, does. So those are among the things that we've cited in our lawsuit. And it was just a couple of weeks ago that the federal district court in Southern New York ruled that the White House attempt to dismiss our suit was without founding and that our lawsuit can go forward and heard on the merits. They claimed that we have no standing and there's no real harm. But the federal judge has agreed to move this forward. So now we're in an expedited process of discovery, trading documents with the White House on the specifics in our allegations. So we'll be hearing more about that, I think, in the weeks to come.
Thank you, Tom. Bill, what is your international approach? Because you worked also abroad as an award-winning journalist and documentarist. So you're familiar also about other regimes and how the rest of the world is reacting to the messages that receives from the US.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for attending this. I'm really honored to be among this company, and thank you, Susan and Sissel, for your terrific opening statements. As Thanos said, I've spent most of my professional life living overseas. I lived for 4 years in Mexico and 7 years in Nicaragua during the 1980s, covering the conflicts in Central America. That's where Frank Smythe and I met in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And I can tell you that, Washington gives license to all of these people who now are using the same language of enemy of the people and fake news. I mean, it's coming out verbatim. And this really endangers people's lives. When we were working in Central America, there was a lot of the same dynamic going on in that, supporters of some of the right-wing military dictatorships there were calling us journalists, communist sympathizers and so forth, out of control left-wingers. And that really gives license to people who want to hurt people like us, especially the freelancers. And I just released a film about freelancers in Mexico. And Mexico is one of the places where dangerous that is most dangerous to working journalists there. About 100 journalists in the past 10 years have been killed in Mexico. About 25 others are missing and presumed dead. And they feel kind of abandoned by Washington, in the sense that Washington has allowed their opponents, the people who want to silence them, to take them out with absolutely no consequences at all. In places like Brazil, where there are environmental activists trying to save the Amazon, they're walking around. These are people who are walking around with targets on their backs, because Brazil is the country where that suffered the greatest loss of journalists and environmental activists in South America, people associated with the Amazon. And they're out there trying to save this forest for all of us, and with absolutely no assistance from at least this administration. So, these are, as Sissel said at the beginning, these are really, really dark times. And if we think it's dark here, it's much, much darker in places like Latin America.
Thank you, Bill. Bricio, you are in the field of the coverage as the White House correspondent. And you are also a foreigner. You have been a foreign correspondent from Spain. Can you share your experience as a foreigner and as a foreign correspondent of how you perceive the whole situation in the media landscape in the US and globally?
Yeah, and I'd love to also hear about how you've been covering the administration in this media landscape as well. What's your approach at VOA?
Okay. Let me start by saying, well, thank you for doing this. It's a pleasure to be with all of you amazing colleagues here. Bill, I think you're absolutely right when you were talking about Mexico. Let me start by saying this. Actually, let me point out this information. Mexico has been for years the country with the highest number of journalist deaths in a country with no conflict. So that says a lot. Of course, the landscape in Latin America, I've worked covering Latin America for a long time. And the situation of journalism and rights over there for our fellow journalists is concerning, to say the least, in many countries in this region. We are seeing that exacerbating during the pandemic, as Sissel was mentioning at the very beginning, those opening statements. We are seeing that in Nicaragua. We are seeing that in Venezuela. We don't know what the official figures, whether the official figures are real or are not showing what's real. But also we are seeing how governments in those countries are even taking control of whatever they can more than ever. So we are seeing like autocracies in these countries, the exacerbating during these times. But we don't have to go that far. As we were mentioning, all of us, we see too in the US during the COVID-19 crisis, we are seeing how certain situations with the press are being exacerbated and concerning at the same time. The White House, for instance, we are seeing how the president is attacking the press on a daily basis. We are seeing that. And what I think is even more concerning, and we don't really talk about this that often, is how the president and the administration is using taxpayers' money, is using government funds to actually create campaigns against the media. We are seeing how lately in these briefings, they are showing videos that have been produced in the White House against the media to actually say to the American citizens, hey, what you're hearing is not true. Don't believe the American media, or I should say certain media outlets. So that's concerning, I believe. Also, we are seeing the fact that we see this on a daily basis, it shouldn't become a norm, or it shouldn't become normal, because I have the feeling this is what's happening. And the message, we've been hearing this message from this administration, from this president for so long, that I believe like many citizens now are starting to believe, oh, okay, so, this is the new normal. This is all right now. I know we kind of forget that this is not normal. This didn't happen before. This is not normal. And we need, as journalists, to keep reminding people this is not normal, and it's concerning to you, and to have the right that you deserve to fair information. And it's also very concerning being in the White House and seeing the situation now. And during this crisis, why am I saying this? Because we are seeing how it's now that not all journalists can attend those meetings. Even though you are credentialed, you cannot go to all meetings because, and this is not just the White House, it's also the Association of White House Correspondents. We all agreed that we needed to take some measures in order to prevent, like health situations among the correspondents that are working there on a daily basis. So because of that, we decided that the association decided that only journalists that have, or media outlets, I should say, that have an assigned seat can attend the briefings nowadays during this pandemic. Okay, this might sound as something that is the right state to take, but at the same time, when you don't provide, and I'm talking now from the point of view of this administration of the White House, when you don't provide a platform in order to let all or most a big amount of journalists to ask the questions they need to ask or they want to ask, that is concerning from my point of view as well. Many countries in the world during this pandemic have been creating, they are going telematic. They are just like giving the option to participate, just like we are doing now, in the press briefings of their governments. The White House hasn't even mentioned this possibility. So what we have is a very small number of journalists covering the president and having access to the president. And that's also concerning because of the media landscape that we have nowadays here in the US. It is very polarized. We're seeing how it kind of became also like a ratings game, right? Like as much as the president needs the media in order to send out his message, the media, especially cable news, needs the president to keep the high ratings. Mm-hmm. So that is also very concerning, and that should be something that we should be questioning as journalists from within as well.
Thank you, Bricio. Frank, Bricio just mentioned something that we need to remind the society that what is happening is not normal. What is your view on why we need to make this reminder to the society about the role that media play as part of our democracies? Do you think that the society itself has a little bit distancing itself from the meaning on the importance that media play in our political and social context and systems? What is your view on that? We just need to unmute, I think, yourself. Now we can.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate being here. What Bill said, and this notion of the way there were threats against the press back in the 80s in Central America and elsewhere. But what's happening now is not normal because the level of distrust of the media, both inside the United States and especially around the world, where it may be even more dangerous over time, is really increased. The level of distrust of everything you hear is crazy. And normally it's only authoritarian, non-democratic nations where you get these kinds of attacks against the press. To see them coming from within democratic nations or pluralistic nations, including the United States, is terribly disturbing, and that is not normal. And the other thing that is not normal is the normalization of attacks and violence against the press. Mm-hmm. The murder of Khashoggi a year and a half ago in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul was an outrageous crime, a Sopranos level type crime, which the president and the Secretary of State each apologized for, which was swept under the rug, even though the evidence was overwhelming. That and by the principle of command accountability, it had to go up to Mohammed bin Salman, but he's gotten away with that. And now, as Sissel, in your excellent summary to start us off, noted with the journalists in prison, Saudi Arabia, I worked for CPJ for a very long time and still follow their work. Saudi Arabia has been a repressive society for a long time, but the number of people behind jail has really increased under Mohammed bin Salman, and that's a problem. The same thing has happened in Turkey. China's been on the wrist for a while, for a very long time, but Turkey has now reached that role. And the problem that I see is the rhetoric coming out from the United States by the president worries me for two reasons. Number one, as we move toward an election period, and there's increasing distrust of information, which COVID-19, the pandemic, has made the polarization and distrust much worse. I fear there's going to, and these armed protests you're seeing, which are very anti-establishment on some level, very anti-press, as well as being against democratic governors who've imposed stay-at-home rules. As we move toward the election, I fear there's going to be more of these kinds of protests and the possibility for violence, including violence against the press, including the possibility that the president could lose an election and may resist leaving office, right? I think this is something that worries me. And overseas, the notion that you can call media outlets fake news, that's become normalized, right? And that is really a problem, as Bricio said. And we already had regimes in places like China, in places like Russia, in places like Brazil, in places like Venezuela. It's not left or right. It's about despots and authoritarianism who've been cracking down on the press, but now they feel legitimized because even the president of the United States, which has long been, with a very mixed record on human rights, but nonetheless has often been a beacon in support of press freedom in different nations around the world, that no longer is the case, right? We're seeing a rise of authoritarian regimes in places like Hungary and Brazil, but also China and Russia that have no interest in human rights or press freedom are expanding their reach, and not only in their own countries, but around the world. The coalition for universal values, democracy and press freedom that the United States, Canada, the United States was leading with Western Europe as well as Japan, that is all broken down now with the United States out. So going forward, I'm really worried about this darkness that Sissel alluded to getting much worse, on top of, as Tom pointed out, and I also worked with Tom before, all the loss of media outlets in the United States and elsewhere creates another problem. So press freedom is going to require figuring out a way to find sustainable journalism and make it work. And I have no magic answer, but I know people are working on that. And that's a hope. But also revitalizing the notion that the society, all of us are better off when we have an informed press, that we have to defend the right to report and share information so we're all more informed. COVID-19 should give us a perfect opportunity to make that claim because we want to know about what's happening with this virus. But these challenges, not only to the press, but anybody who stands up and says, I'm a scientist like Dr. Fauci, I have something to say about this, I have experience with this, are being challenged for no reason in a knee-jerk reaction by a great many people. And we're going to have to regain the trust of people, to regain and not just people we necessarily agree with, a wider range of people across the political spectrum in the United States and overseas, at the same time that we maintain vigilance for press freedom at home and denounce attacks and harassment as they occur, and maintain vigilance as they occur overseas. Because the other thing, murders of journalists are still, they declined in 2019, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're over. It just means that enough people were killed in 2018 that people got the message. And the best example, one of the best examples of that, besides a great many other nations, is of course Mexico, where journalists have been murdered with impunity and continue to be murdered with impunity, as you have all mentioned, some of you have mentioned. And that's continuing unabated. And it really is an indication of how bad things can be. And you don't have to be in a war to have press freedom totally ripped to shreds.
Bill, you wanted to say something on Fran's comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one component to this discussion about the abnormality, the situation that we're in now. I teach I teach journalism students at American University, and I have a class that I built for the university called Foreign Correspondents. You can guess what that's about. And that's normal. But what's abnormal about this is that, I find it difficult sometimes, quite honestly, to encourage students to go into this craft, not only because of, you know, the situation of the market right now, the job market. But also, I mean, in one of my classes this semester, I had Diane Foley come in and talk to my students. She is the mother of James Foley, who everybody knows was captured by ISIS and executed online. And I find myself, you know, telling students, you know, that you have to, and I'm using the James Foley Foundation safety guide as one component of my teaching exercises in the classroom. And I'm not talking about, you know, students who aspire to be foreign correspondents who want to go overseas, or some of them even want to cover conflict. I'm talking about, you have to, you know, pay attention to some of these concepts here when you go to these upcoming rallies and political demonstrations and so forth that we're going to see, you know, as the campaigns start to really get moving. You have to be concerned about your physical safety in some of these places. Not when you want to go to South America or to Mexico or to Iraq or Afghanistan. It's when you go to Texas, Minnesota, you know, wherever in our country, you have to worry about your physical safety. And that, to me, is really discouraging. And once again, as we all know, the license for this comes from the White House. The example comes from the White House. The permission comes from the White House. That's abnormal.
It is abnormal.
Tom?
Can I just add something to that? That started with the Obama administration in a way, and his crackdown on whistleblowers. I mean,
Yes.
let's not forget that Trump went very far, his theatrical attack on the media. But recently, Nancy Pelosi, as you all know, you know the news, she said that, you know, if Donald Trump attacks whistleblowers, I'm here to come and, you know, save these whistleblowers. Where was she during the Obama administration, where even New York Times journalists weren't safe? So I think that we have to go back and see how administration after administration has had maybe different rhetoric, but some policies to curtail the media in one way or the other. And, you know, with the First Amendment in the United States, and with the United States leading the example in many ways, as you all mentioned, in freedom of speech and freedom of the press, that's concerning as well. So just to put that out there. Thanos, go ahead. Sorry.
Tom, you wanted to mention something. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is a very rich conversation, and I'm prompted to think of things every time someone else speaks here. On Susan's last point, I think that the Trump administration and the president himself has gone way, way further than Obama ever did. I think you said that. As I recall, the issue in the Obama years was about release of classified information that, you know, may or may not have been vital to the national security of the United States. That's one kind of discussion about whistleblowers. What Frank mentioned and what we all know about the disparagement, the marginalization, the dismissals of truth tellers who are dealing with non-classified information like public health. The sidelining of Dr. Bright last week and the constant denigration of Dr. Fauci. All of this takes truth tellers being under attack by their own government while they work in the government. It's gone to a whole nother level. But I also wanted to turn the conversation in a little different direction and say that I don't think the attacks, the effort to try to delegitimize professional journalism has ultimately succeeded. And in this coronavirus context, I think it's become more apparent that people can tell the difference between the bloviating that the president does, his bluster, his threats, and what they really want to hear about the facts of a fatal public health threat to everybody in this country. And if I'm sure you've seen that in the last week or two, public confidence in the veracity of what the president says has gone down to about 25%, while the public confidence in the value of what is said by the medical professionals like Fauci and Birx and others has gone up. And so when it matters, when it's a matter of life and death, it's clear that the American public is able to sort these apart and be able to tell the difference. So I find that hopeful. I think up until now, it's been something of a rally party kind of amusement thing for a lot of Trump supporters to be able to laugh and shout as he denounces the news and the enemy of the people. The portion of our society that believes that and really feels that remains a minority. May have gotten a little smaller in the context of this corona crisis. still there. It's still troubling. And we're going to have to go through a lot of repair and education and rebuilding of public morale and public confidence in the next few years. And I would also point as a small hopeful matter to the revival of interest in civic education in the United States. Many more initiatives to promote media literacy going on at the high school, college level. So the dangers of not knowing our history, the dangers of not being able to tell fact from fiction in what is presented as news, I think has gotten to such a level that there are a lot of new initiatives that are out there to kind of rebuild the knowledge base that has been allowed to wither, I think, in society in recent years. There's lots to be done, but I think there's a lot of people.
Sissel, I have one question for you. Although we discussed about, how the governments around the world and in the US are trying to, minimize the risk they face from reporters who are reporting the truth, and the truth don't serve the government's interests. Do you feel that the new generations of journalists, because I know that you are, in the Hunter College of Journalists, for example, do you think that the new generation of journalists are facing the feeling of self-censorship, of being a little bit afraid to overpass some limits?
I don't think so at all. I think that the number of students going into journalism around the country has actually risen. During the last few years, our program at Hunter College has doubled in the last 3 years, and people are really viewing journalism as a call to service. And they feel empowered, I think, by the great work that so many of our journalists are doing. So I don't get that sense at all. In fact, I think the new generation feels empowered and realizes how important journalists are to our democracy. And just to elaborate on Tom's point, this is such an important time to educate our young people, beginning in grade school, middle school, high school, and college, about the value of a free press and what is good journalism, so that they're willing to pay for it and to support our news outlets. We have a course at Hunter College called News Literacy in a Digital Age, and this has now gotten a QED Common Core designation, so any student can take it, and it counts for sophomore English. This is how we're getting students interested in journalism and getting them educated about the value of journalism. So I think that's so important. And just to elaborate on Bill and Frank's comments, the attacks on US journalists have already started, and I really fear that they are going to grow as the election season really heats up. Just a few weeks ago in California, a Fox News camera crew was actually kidnapped by a protester who didn't want to be shown in their video of a protest. So it's the violence. There's a whole new attitude. Instead of just having verbal disagreements, that people will resort to violence against journalists. And I definitely fear that that is going to continue.
Bill, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that there is a bright spot in this otherwise pretty dark picture. And that is, I think, the emergence of all of these groups that have been, coming out in support of good journalism and are actually generating good journalism. And they include, the ACOS Foundation that's based in London, a culture of safety. There's the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, which is based here in Washington, D.C. You have the Ground Truth Project. I think it's based in Chicago. You've got Sebastian Junger's organization, RISC. It's an acronym, RISC. The Overseas Press Club. Most of these nonprofits are dedicated to the promotion, the protection, and dissemination of good journalism. And that, to me, is a reason to be hopeful of the craft's future and the future of the people who practice it.
Mm-hmm.
If I may add something to that, you asked Thanos, you asked Sissel whether new upcoming journalists are feeling this self-censorship, right? I was a foreign correspondent in Russia for almost 6 years, and I could see how Russian journalists actually apply that self-censorship most of the time. Like not even, like the government doesn't even need to intervene. They intervene themselves before the government does. And that's in a way that's a result of how people are brought up and how they grew up. And in a way, I can see that in the US in the complete opposite extreme. What I try to say here is that something that I learned by being a foreign correspondent in Russia all those years is how to become critical with your own truth, or what we believe is our own truth. And what I mean by that is that we grow up consuming a certain type of information from certain type of media outlets. And sometimes journalists don't see beyond that. And we see it here with Russia, like everything that comes from Russia seems to be evil, right? And I had friends, American friends, who came visit me when I lived in Moscow, and they had all these ideas of what Russia was. And when they came to Moscow, they saw a complete different city of what they were expecting. So, you know, sometimes we need to break through that wall of what we believe all those other truths are, because let's not forget this. There's always, whenever we analyze information from an administration, there's always a political interest behind, and there's history in the back. So in order to be able to get the truth, you need to analyze what for instance, the Trump administration or whatever US administration is at the time wants to do or is trying to do, and what the Russia, China, Iran administrations are trying to do as well. And there's always some truth in everything they say. It is true that the way they manage the country is very different in all these countries, but I think that sometimes we just fail in the attempt of getting or telling the truth just by being so biased of what is evil and what is good. And it's not always, absolute truths is something that I learned are not real. So that's one thing on the self-censorship. Another thing that I wanted to add is this kind of crisis, like this pandemic. In every single, history told us that in every single crisis, there's always an opportunity to polarize the country and an opportunity for populism to rise. So this is what we're seeing here. And we are seeing how populist movements are growing. We're seeing it here. We're seeing it in Brazil. We're seeing it in Venezuela. We are seeing it in the far right parties all over Europe that are gaining momentum every year. So that is very concerning as well. And that's something that happens in every single cycle of history. So it's very hard to fight against that, just because it's been proven that this is how society behaves. And there's always people trying to take advantage of this kind of crisis to engage in this populist movement and trying to send the message out. And a third point that I wanted to raise here is regarding here in the US, how this pandemic is being handled and how this is affecting as well journalism and freedom of the press. Obviously, we are seeing how this administration is manipulating data the same way other countries are. We are seeing, why is the Trump administration giving us or trying to portray the number of tests that they are doing all over the country in per capita numbers, right? Per capita figures, but they're giving the number or trying to give the number of deaths in absolute numbers. There's a reason, because otherwise it's not convenient, the figures that we will get if we would calculate the other way around these numbers. So, you know, there's manipulation. We need to be aware of all these techniques. And also there's a reason why all journalists are not really following the information that the CDC is giving in terms of figures. We all went to Johns Hopkins, and that's the information we're following. Why? Because the CDC is not being efficient, and that can be a result of certain things. It can be by the direction of the administration. We don't know that. It can be by lack of efficiency because of the resources they have or the way they operate. We don't know that. But the thing is that there's a reason, because there's a reason why all media outlets decided to follow Johns Hopkins and not the government agency, you know, like the CDC.
Yeah, thank you, Bricio. I would like to open also the stage to questions because we have a lot of participants who are raising their hands. Benjamin, do you want to ask a question?
I surely do want to. I hope I'm clear
Please
enough.
introduce yourself.
Okay, hi. My name is Benjamin Tete. I'm a journalist from Ghana. I just finished my graduate studies at NYU. And interestingly, one of those topics that I was interested, which I worked on as my capstone project, was relating to independence of the media, especially on the African continent. And I've been hearing again some of the narrations so far from Latin America, from here in the US. This week, for example, a lot of the cases from the West African region has to do with not prosecution, but attacks on journalists because of COVID-19 related cases. In Liberia, the chief prosecutor, for example, is using state of emergency powers to shut down media over fake news allegations. In Cameroon, we've heard just this week, the military had to shut down this pidgin anchor, Samuel Wazizi, related, not just Corona, but related to freedom of speech, as well as, of course, the situation in Cameroon. The same with Nigeria, in Egypt. So yes, these are all growing concerns that journalists, we are all concerned about. Particularly, I'm happy that the case of the US here has also been highlighted. A lot of times our countries look to some of these countries, to the US, to Europe and the rest. And so people are learning, people are following some of these precedents. I remember the day I heard President Trump talk about the right to open states, and when he had that like kind of misunderstanding or dispute with the governance over who has the right to open the states. It was a big concern because suddenly you see the president basically declaring omnipotence. These are some of the cues that some of our leaders look out for. And once they have those, they jump on them and they begin to make crazy laws. So yes, I just wanted to say it's been I'm glad for the works people like the CPJ are doing, Amnesty International in West Africa, the Media Foundation for West Africa have all been doing in documenting cases country by country basis, on monthly basis, to see how they are doing. A lot more we'll have to do, and I'm happy for collaborations like this for us to be sharing our stories and also highlighting them, and hopefully put pressure on the necessary authorities to be to bring in the change that we all want.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Benjamin. We have a question, Susan. I would like to address this question to you. One of our participants is asking, do you think, and do we think that the media themselves are covering the Trump administration particularly objectively? And Frank, we would love to hear also your view on that.
Okay, are they covering it objectively? No, I don't think it's an objective coverage, because I think there is an unhealthy relationship between the media and the Trump administration that we can go on for a different panel on and on where this relationship started and how it needs a lot of therapy to get fixed. No, they don't cover it objectively, but the Trump administration is at fault in many ways. The mainstream media in the United States right now, there are people that think is very Democrat dominated. They see stories like for example, the Joe Biden case right now with the sexual assault case, and how the Kavanaugh case was, the story regarding Brett Kavanaugh, Supreme Court Justice, was handled regarding her sexual assault case. And they're trying to make distinctions why Tara Reade, the accuser of Joe Biden, hasn't been appearing on TV like Kavanaugh's accuser was. So, you know, these are distinctions that people are making. They're trying to figure out. And it's not just about the Trump administration. I think it goes wider right now about Republicans and Democrats. And I think we have to, and this is what I've been always arguing since President Trump came into office, is we have to cut through this Trump symptom. We have to bring parties back together and the American people back together and their trust in the media, because once Trump leaves, it's going to be back to a two-party system. And what are we going to do then? How are we going to sort of survive this polarization then? Is the American public going to see an objective media after the way it has been handled or mishandled by the Trump administration, the way it's been, you know, with that relationship? So no, I don't think it's objective. I think it's been a very difficult situation to handle, and it's both sides are at fault, but the president should not be attacking the press the way it is. It's just it's not right. The world is watching.
Frank, what is your view on that?
Yeah, I think I disagree a little bit. I think the media, I think most of the media, because what you define as the media is problematic, but I think most of the media has covered the pandemic reasonably objectively, to the degree that the term is even relevant. I think there's been good news out there. The problem is,
I'm sorry, was the question about the pandemic, or has the media covered the Trump administration? Fair.
The second, the Trump administration.
The Trump administration. Okay.
Thank you. I think the media, I think most of the media has covered the Trump administration objectively and fairly. It's not our job to repeat what presidents or what officials say without being critical, without asking questions, without attempting to verify whether that information exists. Because if we're just being stenographers, then we're contributing to essentially propaganda. And asking tough questions is a strong tradition in American journalism, going back to Sam Donaldson with "Hold on, Mr. President" to Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and a continuation of that. And what's the problem is that the Trump administration, the president himself and his supporters and many of his advisors, see any hostile questions, any questions that are challenging at all, that are challenging their information or challenging them to produce evidence to back up what they're saying, or to try and demonstrate how they verified what they're saying, is seen as somehow unobjective and hostile. And that is a step toward authoritarianism, or an authoritarian posture in my book. And I think that is very dangerous. We're not here to tell the public what the president wants us to tell the public. We're here to tell the public what the president says, and then vet and verify how much of it is true and how much of it is untrue. And what's abnormal here, what's not objective, is the amount of disinformation that's coming from the White House itself and from the president himself. And the best example of this is, if you watch those press conferences, you see Birx and especially Fauci struggling with things the president is saying. So the problem is the information is contradictory, often misleading, full of attacks. So it's hard to sift through it to find out what's going on. And the result is, I think most of the population is somewhat confused about what the actual guidelines are. And it opens the door for people to do what they want. Wear a mask, but I'm not going to wear a mask because I'm not going to wear a mask, right? This doesn't help. These mixed signals. So this is an incredibly tough time. And I think the White House press corps and most of the press that's covering the president, I think, has done a good job. I think the problem is the president just can't stop attacking the press instead of working with the press to get good information out there.
Thank you, Frank. Let's take 3 questions because we have a list of several attendees who want to ask questions. Please, let's take 3 questions. Who is gonna go first from the attendees, if you hear us? Alex?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. And this is very compelling presentation. I appreciate the chance. As you know, press freedom has been shrinking in our part. I cover Azerbaijan and wider the Eurasia region. But recently, as you know, given this COVID-19, the authorities in the region, in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, they're using this corona as cover to step up crackdown on journalists. My question is, where is the U.S. in all of this, Tom? Given your previous experience and your current capacity, do you think what kind of leverages do we have in terms of defending press freedom globally? The Magnitsky Act is the only game in town, but are there other leverages that you could list here? Thank you very much.
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. One is that obviously we've lost the value of the White House bully pulpit in advocating for the protection of journalists in other countries and the defense of press freedom writ large. At the same time, many U.S. ambassadors around the world, many aid missions, the State Department writ large, are providing sustenance and support, training, safety training for journalists in various parts of the world. And we do see statements and pressure from individual embassies in various parts of the world coming out in defense of journalists who are under attack by their own governments or by non-state actors, whether it's criminal gangs in Mexico or terrorists in other parts of the world. So it's not that the U.S. is completely turned off. What's turned off or turned around is the most visible American. It's no longer the business of speaking up for professional journalism at home and abroad. And so again, I think there's reason to be somewhat hopeful going forward. I don't want to get too political here, but I can't help noting that today, May 3rd, is not only World Press Freedom Day, but it's also exactly 6 months till Election Day. So some light at the end of the tunnel. And I think it'll be important for journalism in America to continue to try to provide objective, inclusive, fact-based information to the public about what's going on in the world, especially in this time of the public health crisis, and notwithstanding the confused mixed messages that come from the White House, and also to continue to report without fear or favor, as the UNESCO for this year's World Press Freedom Day commemoration. And to be able to report on all sides, again, accurately and without fear or favor. Not favoring the side against Trump, but trying to expose the shortcomings in public institutions, government, whether corporate or government. I think there's a lot to be done in these critical next 6 months. Make sure that we do have an informed electorate going.
Thank you, Tom. Bill and Stella, I would like to ask you a question in regards to the editorial independence, because part of the principle and the concept of press freedom is, of course, the capability and the capacity of the journalists themselves to write with freedom and to report the truth with freedom without any restraints. But how do you think that this editorial independence can be secured in our days when media organizations are sometimes running out of money? They need advertisements. There are media organizations, particularly in many countries in Europe and including Greece, where they receive money from the state. So to some extent, they cannot be completely independent. What is your perspective on particularly the topic of editorial independence for journalists, how they can reassure that this exists and this is reinforced?
You want me to respond to that?
Yes, Bill. Tom, of course, but I would like also Sissel and Bill to have an opinion.
Okay. Well, let me just say, we published a report, PEN America published a report in November about this ongoing decades-long crisis in local news gathering. And one of the things we pointed to is the probable need for public funding for journalism at the local level. And we look back to the creation of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting back in the 1960s, when Congress decided, based on a report of the Carnegie Commission, 1967, to create this Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which provides some funding to local radio and television stations across the country. And while it's not without controversy, it's a model to look to, and many people think that it is a successful way to provide a portion of the funding that local broadcast news depends on. And it may be that going forward, there could be some kind of national endowment for journalism or adjunct to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that could provide some public funding. In the current crisis moment, of course, we're seeing that under the Small Business Administration's Paycheck Protection Program, that some loans, forgivable loans, essentially grants, are going to some local news outlets. And that is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, one of the things that has attracted a lot of members of Congress in both parties to this idea that certainly in this crisis moment, journalism should be one of the sectors of our economy that benefits from this kind of public subsidy crisis. And it may be a segue to a longer term discussion about whether there's some way to create a funding for local journalism that has a firewall that protects the editorial independence of journalists and their editors from pressure by government to only report favorably on officials. So, and we think that one of the ways to get there is to convene another kind of commission, a federal advisory commission that would pull together stakeholders, both those who are anxious about the implications of public funding and those who think it's a necessary part of this. Get people from both parties around the same table to try to build a plan going forward beyond the current crisis moment.
Sissel?
Yeah, I think editorial independence is paramount. And just to echo what Frank said, so a lot of people sometimes ask me, why is the press so anti-Trump? And you have to flip it around. The press is not anti-Trump, it's pro-truth. And because, again, this is not normal, the amount of disinformation that's coming out of the White House, this is not normal. And the press has to step up and vet and verify the information, just like Frank said. So editorial independence is completely important. And I also agree with Tom that there are lots of models to support journalism. Look at the BBC. They receive government funding, but they are a premier news outlet you know, in the UK and around the world. I think that we are going to have to think of different ways to support journalism, and not just through the federal level, but also state, local, and also philanthropic organizations. There already is a lot of interesting funding coming from foundations that we can tap into. And also getting the public just to subscribe. If every member of the public just subscribed to their local news outlet, that would go a long way to solving the crisis, the financial crisis that we're in right now.
Thank you, Sissel. Bill?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that when we talk about the media, that's a whole constellation of organizations and people and opinions and perspectives on life. And going, you know, so I think it's the burden of the consumer to rely not on a single or one slice of this huge world of information out there, but if we're really responsible citizens, you know, it's the onus is upon us to read, listen to, and watch different sources of information and then we can select. You know, if we have any degree of critical thinking, we can select, you know, and look for the truth. Going back a couple of steps back about this whole discussion of truth and covering this administration, it's okay if Donald Trump wants to, you know, propagate the birther fantasy about Barack Obama being not a U.S. citizen. It's okay if he wants to lie about, you know, the size of the crowd at his inauguration. It's okay if he wants to lie about, you know, paying porn stars for their services. Those are victimist lies. But when we start to have this nonstop, you know, avalanche of lies coming out about things like this virus, we're talking about, you know, endangering the lives of others. That's where journalism is really crucial. No matter what your editorial slant is, no matter where, you know, what slice of this large world of media outlets you're paying attention to, that that has to be corrected. And it's our job, I think, as Frank was pointing out, we're supposed to be looking for truth. We're supposed to be telling people, you know, this is true, this is not true. You decide where you're going to go. You decide where you're going to vote, for example. That's our job.
If I
Thank
may
you,
add,
Yeah.
Let's take one more question from our attendees, and then we will close with a short message of all our panelists
that I would like to ask each one of you. We have a question here. Okay, let's go ahead. I would like to start from Bricio, then go to Susan, Frank, Sissel, Tom, and Bill. Each one of you, I would like to to summarize our discussion by answer what is your major hope and your major fear in regards to the independence of press and the press freedom in the US and across the globe. Bricio?
Okay, my major fear, I guess, it's one of the points that I raised here in this discussion, which is that every single crisis leads to a more polarized population, and the populism usually rise during those times. So that's probably the fear, that we are actually at one of those stages in which we're probably going to see how populism rises again, and how people keep not trusting the media, and that's a challenge for us. The hope that I have is that many people now are claiming, oh, there's so much fake news because our governments are saying there are fake news, so journalism is dead. And actually, it's quite the opposite. I think journalism is more alive than ever. I don't remember any other time in my career what I fact-checked as much as I did now. And I'm pretty sure that applies to every single colleague of mine. Like, we became fact-checkers all of a sudden. Journalists always were fact-checkers, but that's part of our job. But I think the amount of fact-checking we are doing these days, it's something that we weren't even thinking about like a few years back. So that gives me hope, how we are readapting to the new times, how regardless of this amount of tweets and how politics actually, President Donald Trump actually started this politics on Twitter, right? Which the pace of information is something that challenges the resources of media outlets, journalists. We are exhausted because like the news cycle is so intense. So we are reinventing the way we're doing journalism. We are adapting to the new challenges that are emerging these days. And that gives me hope. I think journalism is more alive than ever. And I think that's a good thing. And hopefully, we keep doing this job, and this helps for future generations to see that our job is actually vital in this society, and we have a social duty, and we need to bear that in mind.
Thank you, Bricio. Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to end on an optimistic note as well. I think one of the things that Sissel and Bill both alluded to was the fact that editorials are very important. So are local newspapers and supporting local news. I think Tom also talked about that. Support your community, support your local news networks. That's where it starts. But also, I think with the overflow of information, as we talked about, there is a robust opportunity for citizen journalism right now as well, for citizens to go out and find their facts. We journalists have your backs. We will try to cover the truth as much as possible, but there's a great deal of opportunity and information for people to go out there and find their own facts. And I think that that's the beauty of this profession, of first of all, having the First Amendment here in the United States, having a free press, freedom of expression. That's at the forefront of the Constitution, and I hope that these things will work itself out, whether President Trump is in office or anyone else is in office. And around the world, it's difficult. I'd like to say thank you to every single journalist that's putting their lives on the line for us to get accurate, efficient news. I've worked in some of the most repressive governments and regimes, and it's not easy to navigate. I get it, I understand it, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who's continuing that path.
Thank you, Susan. Frank?
Well, I'd like to be optimistic, and I'll end on an optimistic note. But one of the things that I want to point out is that during the Obama administration's first term, we had the Congressional Caucus for Freedom of the Press established in Congress, which I thought was a great advancement at the time. And it was set up by Adam Schiff, who recruited Mike Pence to be the other co-chair, right? So that's an extraordinary thing, a bipartisan caucus looking at press freedom in nations irrespective of the political context, just looking how they're treating the press. That consensus is broken down, unfortunately, obviously now, and I think it's going to require a great deal of work to rebuild that. So we have to realize that the polarization we've seen overseas is spread to the United States. So we have to look outside of Congress at the moment and the U.S. government to find a way to sustain and support independent journalism in this country and around the world, and take stock of that loss. I'm optimistic, however, because I train freelance journalists in this country, and I've met great, motivated, smart journalists who are on the front lines in their own communities and overseas that are doing great work. And I've also met, through CPJ and since then, a great many journalists like our guest from Ghana who work in countries that are much higher risk to report on, with a much higher risk of retaliation than has traditionally been the case in the United States. And these journalists are continuing to work very hard, including in places like Mexico, where it's become increasingly difficult. So I'm taking stock of the decline, but also I'm optimistic about what I'm seeing on the ground for the future.
Thank you, Frank. Sissel.
My biggest fear is the different realities that people in our country are living in, depending on which news outlet, where you're getting your news, what media you're consuming. And this really speaks to that polarization of information and politicization of information. And I really think we have to call on the audience to do more, to become more news literate, and to be able to distinguish what's fact from fiction themselves. And I am going now offer a shameless plug for my website, newsliteracymatters.com, which we set up for students, but it's become a primer for anyone who wants to become more news literate. And I'm putting the address on our chat so you can check it out and subscribe if you like it, and please share the link with your friends. And I also want to thank all the journalists that are risking their own freedom and even lives to report the information that we all need to be free and self-governing.
Thank you, Sissel. Tom.
Well, I guess my greatest fear at this moment is that the journalism sector will continue to shrink and collapse due to economic pressures, due to political attacks, and it will come out of the current coronavirus crisis much more weakened even than it already is, especially at the local level. I'm hopeful, nevertheless, that more and more people are becoming aware of this very problem, and more people are willing to come together and talk about what the solutions might be. And when I hear Sissel talking about the doubling of the number of journalism students at Hunter College, and I know that most journalists are not being cowed by the attacks from this White House, that they feel more determined than ever. And as Fabrizio put it, as they are going through this kind of stress test on journalism because of all these attacks, it obliges good journalists and editors to step up and double check their facts, triple check things before they put them in print or on the air. And that's only going to strengthen the sector. And so it's like the whole country is going through a national constitutional stress test. It's particularly true of the journalism sector, which after all is the only part of our economy that's mentioned in the US Constitution. First Amendment. So I think it's natural that the journalism be at the center of this, and I'm hopeful that it'll come out stronger in the end, if it's still there on the other side.
Thank you, Tom. Bill.
Thank you, Thanos. Late last year, I had the great honor of being able to screen this documentary that a former student of mine and I produced in Mexico about freelance foreign correspondents working there. And this was screened 2 weeks before the museum, which I always considered to be an icon of a bright icon for our craft and the people who practice it is now closed. And I found that deeply depressing. And my fear is that the craft and its practitioners will continue down that road of becoming, of being gone. On the other hand, you know, and probably because of the students that I deal with at American University, I'm optimistic in that this pandemic will be a parting of the waters, if you will, for consumers of information, and they will see through this crisis that, you know, real information, verifiable facts, science, and people who tell the truth are important for any successful society, and they will you know, embrace the media and its practitioners as a result of this test of fire.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the excellent conversation. I would like to add that, to my perspective, my biggest fear is the sustainability of the business models of the media organizations themselves. And from my experience, I see, for example, a lot of media organizations that are collapsing financially in my country, in Greece, and this puts extra pressure on the journalists working for these media organizations and extra restraints on the independency, the editorial independency of the journalists themselves. At the same time, I see there is a movement of a vital movement of young journalists who get into journalism and they feel that they fulfill a mission of informing the public and serving the public opinion with truth and objectivity. And I think that with this message, we can conclude our conversation. I know there are a lot of questions coming up. If you allow me, I can share all these questions via email with each one of our speakers. And if you have the time, we would appreciate if you can take a look and respond to each one of our attendees. I really appreciate your presence here. Bill Gentile, you're always a great supporter of the Association of Foreign Correspondents, and you're dedicating your time multiple times to help us. Same thing with Sissel McCarthy. A big thank you, Sissel, for being here today again. And you've been also a great supporter of the Foreign Correspondents. Thomas, Melia, thank you for your presence and for your time. And it is a great honor and pleasure to have you in our company in this discussion today. Frank Smith, thank you for being with us today. It was a great pleasure to connect with you and to have this discussion. And thank you for your contributions to our conversation. Suzanne Modares and Bricio Segovia, I'm sure we're going to catch up very soon because the Vice President and the Chair of the Board in DC of the Association of Foreign Correspondents are very well prepared to be present whenever it is needed. Thank you everyone who has been attending this discussion online. I know we have a lot of questions, but the time was so limited, but we will follow up with emails in terms of answering your questions. And have a great evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.